In the wet gray autumn of 1983, 26-year-old Cora Mead inherited a problem that didn't have a name yet. She inherited the 240 acres of her grandfather's exhausted wheat land in central Kansas, land that had fed 3 generations of her family and was now quietly and without ceremony giving up. She inherited the listing grain bins that groaned in the wind, the old farmall tractor that leaked hydraulic fluid onto whatever ground it stood on, and a farmhouse that smelled permanently of dust and old coffee. But most of all, she inherited his silence. The particular silence of a man who had watched something he loved slowly die and didn't know how to stop it. Her grandfather, Harold Mead, had not been a dramatic man. He didn't rage at the banks or curse the weather or blame the government, though he had reason enough for all 3. He simply went quiet in his last years, spending more time sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, staring out the window at fields that produced less each season, no matter how much they put into them. When he died in the spring of that year, a Tuesday, cold for April, Cora drove out from Wichita, where she had been working as a bookkeeper for a construction firm, and stood on the farmhouse porch and understood immediately that she was not going to sell. Everyone assumed she would. Her mother said so plainly, in the kind voice people use when they believe they are being practical. Her cousin Wayne said so less kindly over the phone while asking about the equipment. The banker in town, a soft-faced man named Mr. Bellamy, said so with the professional delicacy of someone who had watched farms change hands his entire career. He sat across from her in his office 3 weeks after the funeral and laid out the numbers like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. The land was depleted. Yields had been sliding for 6 consecutive years. The soil pH was wrong. The organic matter was nearly gone, stripped out by decades of wheat monoculture and aggressive tillage. To bring it back to productivity would require, by his estimate, significant capital investment in commercial fertilizers and soil amendments, anhydrous ammonia, sulfur treatments, weed suppression, the kind of inputs that required the kind of loan that required the kind of yield that the land in its current state could not reliably produce. It was a trap shaped like a solution. "Miss Mead," Mr. Bellamy said, folding his hands on the desk, "your grandfather was a proud man, but pride is a luxury in farming right now. There's no shame in recognizing when a piece of ground has run its course." Cora looked at the numbers on the paper in front of her. Then she looked at Mr. Bellamy. Then she said she would think about it, picked up her coat, and drove back to the farm. She didn't sell. What she did instead was spend 3 weeks in her grandfather's study, reading. Harold Mead had kept records the way other men kept diaries. Not events, but observations. He had notebooks going back to 1951, filled with his cramped, slanted handwriting. Rainfall amounts, frost dates, the color of the wheat at various stages, soil temperatures, and, increasingly in the later notebooks, something else, questions. Long, circling, inconclusive questions about why the land seemed to be losing something that the fertilizers couldn't replace. He had noticed that the fields closest to the dry creek that ran along the property's eastern edge consistently outperformed the rest, even when inputs were identical. He had noted this for years without being able to explain it. On one page, dated August of 1979, he had written a single line and underlined it twice. "Something is alive in that creek bottom that the rest of the fields have lost." He had never acted on it. He was too tired, too deep in the machinery of a farming operation that demanded his constant attention, but he had written it down. And Cora, sitting in his chair reading by lamplight, felt something shift in her chest when she read it. She was not a farmer. She had grown up on this land, but left it at 18 for college and never come back to stay. She knew how to keep books, not how to keep soil. But she was her grandfather's granddaughter, and he had taught her one thing above everything else. That observation was the beginning of understanding, and patience was the beginning of change. She started driving the fields every morning before breakfast. She walked the creek bottom. She dug up handfuls of soil from different sections of the property and compared them in her palm. The soil from the creek-adjacent fields was darker, moister, held together differently. It had a smell, a real living side of a forest that the soil from the main fields completely lacked. The main field's soil was pale and powdery. It ran through her fingers like something that had forgotten what it was supposed to be. She started reading, not just her grandfather's notebooks, but extension bulletins, university research papers she ordered by mail, a book on soil microbiology she found at the Wichita Library. And in all of that reading, a picture began to form, incomplete and jagged around the edges but recognizable. The creek bottom was productive because it had mycorrhizal fungi. It had bacteria. It had a food web, invisible but functional, that processed organic matter into plant-available nutrients in a continuous self-sustaining cycle. The main fields had been tilled and chemically treated so aggressively for so long that this web had been largely destroyed. The fertilizers had been feeding the plants directly, bypassing the system entirely, which was efficient in the short term and catastrophic over decades. The soil wasn't tired. It was empty. There was nothing left alive in it to do the work. The question, then, was how to bring it back. She found the answer in an unexpected place, a short paragraph in a 1976 Radal Press publication about the integration of livestock into grain systems. The paragraph described the practice of winter cover cropping, planting non-cash crops like rye or crimson clover or hairy vetch in the off-season specifically to be killed and incorporated in spring, feeding the soil rather than a market. The paragraph noted, almost as an aside, that farms integrating this practice with managed livestock grazing reported significant improvements in soil biology within 3 to 5 years. The livestock, it said, were not incidental. Their manure, combined with their hooves working organic matter into the surface and their grazing pressure stimulating root growth, was the difference between a cover crop that provided modest benefit and a system that actively regenerated. Cora had no livestock. She had no money for livestock, and no experience with them, and no infrastructure to support them. She had a depleted wheat farm, a small savings account, and a bookkeeper's understanding of how quickly both of those things could disappear. But she had her grandfather's notebooks, and she had that underlined sentence, "Something is alive in that creek bottom that the rest of the fields have lost." She spent 2 months on the phone, calling extension offices, university agricultural departments, and farmers she found referenced in the publications she'd been reading. Most didn't call back. A few did, and were polite but skeptical. One, a sheep farmer in Nebraska named Mr. Ostergaard, talked to her for an hour and a half and told her that what she was describing, cover crops, managed grazing, no tillage, was not impossible, but that she should expect it to get worse before it got better, and that most people gave up before they reached the other side of worse. "How long is worse?" Cora asked. "Depends on how bad your starting point is," Mr. Ostergaard said. "Could be 2 years, could be 4. Cora thanked him and hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen for a long time looking at the fields through the window. Then she drove to the livestock auction in Salina and bought 32 ewes and a ram, spending nearly all of her savings, and brought them home in a rented trailer, unloading them into the south field while the October sky turned the color of a bruise. The story was around the county within a week. Cora Meade, Harold's granddaughter, the bookkeeper who knew nothing about farming, had bought sheep. Not cattle, sheep. and not to run a sheep operation, apparently, but for some scheme involving dirt. She was going to plant grass where the wheat had been and turn sheep loose on it. She was not applying for any loans, not buying any inputs, not doing anything that made sense to anyone who worked land for a living. Her neighbor to the west was a man named Mr. Gruber, a third-generation farmer who ran a tight, conventional operation and had opinions he was not shy about sharing. He pulled up to her fence line one afternoon while she was moving the portable electric fencing she used to rotate the sheep through paddocks, and he sat on his four-wheeler with his arms crossed and watched her for a while. "You know what you're doing?" he finally called. "Learning," Cora said. Mr. Gruber was quiet for a moment. "Those are Rambouillet crosses," he said. "Decent wool sheep. You planning to shear them?" "Eventually," she said. "Right now, I'm planning to let them eat." He looked at the field, at the thin cover of winter rye she had seeded the month before, at the sheep moving steadily across it, with the focused industry of animals doing exactly what they were designed to do. He looked at the portable fencing, the water tank on wheels, the whole improvised, low-budget apparatus of what she was attempting. "Harold would have had something to say about this," Mr. Gruber said, not unkindly. "He did, actually," Cora said. "He just said it in a notebook." Mr. Gruber drove away without answering. She could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had already filed her under a category he understood: grief-addled, city-softened, and over her head. He wasn't wrong about all of it. The official skepticism came in the form of a visit from Mr. Weston, the county extension agent, who had the particular manner of a man who had explained things patiently to confused people for many years and had found it quietly exhausting. He arrived in a county vehicle, clipboard in hand, and walked the fields with Cora with the slightly pained expression of someone who has been asked to evaluate a situation they have already concluded is a mistake. He asked about her fertility plan. She explained the cover crop rotation and the grazing system. He asked about her weed pressure management. She explained that she was not tilling, that she was using the sheep and the cover crop canopy as suppression, that she expected some weed pressure in year one and planned to manage it with targeted grazing and hand pulling in critical areas. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the field. Then he said, in a voice carefully calibrated to avoid condescension while still conveying it, "Miss Mead, I understand the appeal of what I'd call a more philosophical approach to soil management, but the research is very clear on yield expectations for this kind of system in transition. You're looking at 3 to 5 years of below break-even production. Most operations can't absorb that. Most operators don't have that kind of runway." "I'm aware of the timeline," Cora said. "Are you?" He glanced at her. "Because what I'm seeing is a significant capital investment in animals, fencing infrastructure, seed, with no cash crop income on the horizon. If you came to me before making these purchases, I would have counseled you very strongly against it." "I know," Cora said. "That's probably why I didn't come to you first." Mr. Weston looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he made several notes on his clipboard, shook her hand with professional courtesy, and drove back down the dirt road, leaving a thin trail of dust in the November air. She heard later that he mentioned her operation at a county agriculture meeting as an example of the kind of well-intentioned but impractical experimentation that gave sustainable agriculture a bad reputation. The laughter wasn't loud. It was the kind that lives in the pauses of conversations at the co-op and the diner, in the sidelong looks when someone mentions the Mead place. She felt it without hearing it directly, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. "Let me stop here for a moment and ask you something directly. Have you ever made a decision that you knew was right, felt it in a way that was deeper than logic, more certain than facts, while everyone around you was absolutely sure you were wrong? Not rebellious, not dramatic, just quietly, stubbornly certain in a way you couldn't entirely explain. That is where Cora Mead stood in the winter of 1983, on a farm that hadn't turned a profit in years, with 32 sheep, a lot of ryegrass, and a conviction borrowed from her grandfather's handwriting. It is a very specific kind of loneliness. The first winter was brutal in the ordinary ways that Kansas winters are brutal. There was a late November ice storm that took out a section of fence and sent 2 ewes into Mr. Gruber's corn stubble field, an adventure that required Cora to spend a cold afternoon retrieving them and repairing the fence with fingers that stopped working properly somewhere around the 2nd hour. One of the ewes turned out to be pregnant and delivered twins in January, a process that Cora managed with the help of a dog-eared lambing guide and a phone call to Mr. Ostergaard in Nebraska at 11 o'clock at night. She got both lambs through. She was less certain, some days, that she would get herself through. She was burning through savings faster than she had planned. The sheep required more supplemental hay than she had budgeted for during the ice months. A used no-till drill she had bought to seed. The cover crops needed a repair she hadn't anticipated. She kept the books with the same meticulous care she had applied to the construction company's accounts. And she watched the numbers with a bookkeeper's clear-eyed detachment, which was useful in the day and less useful at night when the detachment tended to slip. There was a man who came in the early spring of that first year. His name was Mr. Calloway, a regional representative for one of the large agricultural input companies, and he had heard about the Mead place, the unconventional approach, the financial pressure, and he saw it as an opportunity. He was not unpleasant about it. He had the manner of someone who genuinely believed he was doing her a favor. He took her to lunch at the diner in town, which she accepted because she was tired and the diner made good pie. He told her, over coffee, that her instincts about soil health were actually correct. His company, he said, had a whole line of biological soil amendments, mycorrhizal inoculants, humic acids, proprietary blends of beneficial bacteria that could give her the soil biology she was trying to build in a fraction of the time without the risk and the income loss of a full transition system. She could get the results she wanted and still run a cash crop this fall. She could have it both ways. Miss Mead, he said, his voice warm with the practiced sincerity of a good salesman. I've seen a lot of producers try to do what you're doing the hard way. I respect it, but you don't have to be a martyr to good soil. We can get you there faster with less pain. Cora set down her coffee cup. She looked at the counter for a moment, at the pie case, at the slow rotation of the ceiling fan. My grandfather spent 30 years making this land productive by following the conventional advice, she said, without heat, inputs, tillage, fertilizer programs, and at the end of 30 years, the land was dying. I'm not saying your products don't work. I'm saying I don't believe in buying my way to something I can grow. And I'm saying that if I take on that expense, I'll be dependent on it forever, which is exactly what happened to him. Mr. Calloway was quiet for a moment. His smile didn't vanish. It just settled into something cooler. He said he understood, picked up the check, and told her to call him when she changed her mind. She didn't call him. Now let me tell you what was happening in those fields while the county was making up its mind about her. The rye she planted in fall was doing something invisible and essential. Its roots were drilling down into the compacted subsoil, breaking up the hardpan in a way that no mechanical tillage could replicate at depth. When she terminated the rye in spring, rolling it flat with a borrowed roller crimper rather than tilling it under, it formed a thick, moisture-retaining mat on the soil surface. Under that mat, Fungi were beginning to thread through the decaying residue. Bacteria were multiplying. The sheep's manure, distributed across the paddocks in small, regular amounts by the rotational grazing system, was feeding this microbial explosion with the slow, steady delivery that synthetic fertilizers could never achieve, because synthetic fertilizers, applied all at once, feed plants but overwhelm and often damage the microbial community that plants actually depend on. The soil was beginning to remember what it was. It was slow. The first spring's wheat, she seeded a small test plot in the best performing section, was thin and uneven. It was not a failure, but it was not a success, and she knew that anyone driving by would see it and confirm whatever they already believed about her. She let it go. She photographed it, recorded the plant populations, took soil samples and sent them to the university lab for analysis. She was building data the way her grandfather had built his notebooks, observation by observation, season by season. There was a moment in the second summer when she came close to breaking. It was August, a bad month in Kansas under the best circumstances, and a drought had settled in that made the bad months worse. The cover crop she had seeded in the corn rotation field had established poorly, and the bare patches showed through like accusations. She drove the fields in the pickup one evening, the windows down, the hot, flat air coming through with that particular Kansas smell of dust and something else she could never quite name. Her savings account was nearly gone. She had taken on a small line of credit with the Farm Credit Bank to cover operating costs, which she had told herself she would not do and had done anyway. And the interest was a drip, drip, drip she felt in the back of her throat. She pulled over at the east end of the property, where the creek ran along the boundary. She turned off the truck and sat there in the silence, which wasn't silence. It was meadowlarks and the sound of moving water and the distant murmur of Mr. Gruber's irrigation pivots running in the dusk. She dug up a handful of soil from the creek bank and crumbled it between her fingers. It was dark. It was alive. She could feel it, the structure of it, the way it held together in small aggregates that real soil makes and dead soil doesn't. She dug up a handful from the test field 10 feet away, where the cover crop had established well. Not as dark, not yet, but different from what she had started with. Better. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her grandfather, sitting at his kitchen table in the last years, watching the fields. She thought about the sentence he had underlined. She thought about Mr. Ostergaard's voice on the phone, calm and certain. It gets worse before it gets better, and most people give up before the other side of worse. She drove back to the farmhouse. She made coffee. She opened the current notebook. She had started keeping her own, the same format as Harold's, and she wrote the date and the soil temperature and what she had observed, and then she wrote, "Not yet, but coming." The third year was the year things started to turn. The soil organic matter reading from the university lab on the test plots in the eastern section had moved from 1.1% to 1.9%. That is not on paper a dramatic number, but Cora knew what it meant. She had read enough by then to understand that every 0.1% of organic matter represents an enormous amount of biological activity, an enormous amount of water retention, an enormous amount of nutrient cycling happening underground without any purchased input whatsoever. The soil was building itself. The wheat in the eastern section that year came in strong, not exceptional, but strong, consistent even, without the yellowing that indicated nitrogen deficiency, without the shallow roots that indicated compaction. She pulled plants at intervals across the test section and measured root depth. They were going down farther than anything she had seen on this farm. The roots were following the fungal networks her cover crops had helped establish, finding water and nutrients at depth that surface-applied chemicals could never reach. more earthworms than she had ever seen on this land. She mentioned this to no one. It felt private, somehow. The earthworms in the soil like a secret the farm was keeping, showing only to her. She sent the wheat from the test section to the elevator separately. When the settlement sheet came back, she did the math 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. Yield was 12% below the county average, but her input costs were 68% below the county average. Her net return per acre was higher than it had been in any year of her grandfather's records. She sat at the kitchen table, his kitchen table, with the settlement sheet and the notebook open beside it, and she was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of a man watching something die, a different quiet. The quiet of someone beginning, finally, to believe. The 5th year, the drought came back. It came for everyone, a hard-mouthed, dry summer that began in June and didn't relent until September. The county's wheat average dropped hard. Mr. Gruber, she heard later, had his worst year in a decade. The chemical inputs he depended on couldn't help plants that had no moisture to work with, in soil that couldn't hold the moisture it received, because the organic matter wasn't there to do the holding. Cora's fields were different. The organic matter, sitting at 2.4% on her best ground now, a number that felt almost miraculous against the baseline of 6 years ago, acted like a sponge, capturing every rainfall and releasing it slowly to the roots over days rather than hours. Her deep-rooted cover crop residue had improved the soil structure enough that water infiltrated rather than running off. She irrigated less. Her plants didn't thrive in the drought, but they endured it, which under the circumstances amounted to the same thing. Her yield that year was 8% below her own previous season. The county average was down 31%. The numbers were posted, as they always were, at the elevator. Cora Mead, 47 bushels per acre. County average, 34. She had not just weathered the drought, she had separated herself from it. When a reporter from the Wichita paper called about an agricultural drought impact story and somehow got her name from someone at the elevator, she answered his questions briefly and asked him not to make it more than it was. He made it a little more than it was anyway. The story ran on a Tuesday, small, inside the agricultural section. The headline was reasonable enough, but it had her name in it, and the farm's name, and a description of the system she was running. The silence at the co-op changed. It wasn't loud. It was the absence of a certain kind of sound. The small, particular quiet that falls when people who have been certain about something start to become less certain. Mr. Gruber stopped by the following Saturday. He pulled up to the fence line the way he had 6 years before and sat on his four-wheeler and looked at the fields for a while. "Huh," he said finally. Cora waited. "Organic matter's up that much?" he said. He had clearly read something, or heard something. His voice had the tone of a man doing arithmetic. "On the east section, yes," she said. "The rest of the farm is still catching up." He was quiet again. "Then, how much of that is the sheep?" "All of it," she said. "The sheep, the covers, the no-till, you can't separate them. It's a system." Mr. Gruber nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is not yet convinced, but has stopped being unconvinced. He drove away without committing to anything, which was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. 2 years later, Mr. Calloway's shiny company car reappeared on her road. He had aged in the way that men who travel for a living tend to age, a little hollowed, a little harder around the edges. The biological products division of his company, he told her, had been expanding. Soil health was becoming a selling point in the market. He had been following her results. The yield data was a matter of public record at the elevator, and the university had started citing her farm as a case study in a soil biology program. He didn't apologize. That wasn't his nature, but he sat in the farm truck with her, parked at the edge of the east section in the early evening, and he said, I'll be straight with you. What you've got here is something my company has been trying to sell for 15 years and hasn't been able to produce with a product. Your biology numbers are the best I've seen outside of a research station. Our science team would want to study this. We'd pay for access, consulting arrangement. You'd be compensated well. Cora looked out at the field. The wheat was finished for the season. The stalks rolled flat into a cover mat already beginning to decay. The lambs, grandchildren of those first 32 ewes, were working through the east paddock with the same calm, purposeful industry as their grandmothers. What would the consulting arrangement look like, she asked. We'd want to observe your protocols, document the rotation, the grazing timing, the cover crop species mix. We'd use that to develop a product line, a package system, sell it to other producers. She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the cover mat, a long liquid sound. So you'd take what I've built here, she said, which took 6 years and came from my grandfather's notebooks, and Mr. Ostergaard's patience and a lot of my own bad seasons, and you'd put it in a bag. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. Well, we'd systematize it, yes, make it replicable for producers who don't have the timeline or the time, Cora said. The time is the point. A system that works because of time can't be replaced by a product. The biology builds because the system runs consistently, season after season, with no shortcuts. The moment you sell it as something a producer can apply and skip the patience, you've broken the thing you're trying to sell. She turned to look at him directly for the first time. I appreciate the offer, but the answer is no. He sat with that for a moment. He was smarter than he had been 6 years ago, or at least more honest with himself, because he didn't argue. He nodded, started the car, and drove back down the road. She watched the dust settle in the evening air and felt again that particular quiet. Now I want to tell you what happened over the years that followed, because the harvest of a decision made in a specific moment does not always look the way you expect. In the late 1980s, when interest rates had their second wave and land prices shifted in ways that squeezed the operations that had borrowed heavily against them, Cora was debt-free. She had paid off the farm credit line in year 4. She had no chemical input bills because she had no chemical inputs. What she had was a herd of sheep that had grown to 90 animals, a cover crop seed supply she was saving herself, and a farm that was generating income from wool, occasional lamb sales, and wheat that consistently outperformed the local average at lower cost. Mr. Gruber came to her in 1989. He did not come hat in hand. That was not his nature. He came as a businessman with a proposal. He wanted to graze his neighbor's cover crops with a custom grazing arrangement, and he wanted to know if she could advise him on transitioning one section of his operation. He did not say she had been right. He said he had been looking at his numbers. Cora worked with him for 2 seasons. She did not charge him. She gave him what Mr. Ostergaard had given her, which was time and honesty and the name of the books that had helped her most. He made it through the transition, though not without setbacks she had warned him about, and he had chosen to learn himself. The next 30 years were not simple. She had years when the lambs didn't sell, when the wheat price cratered, when a late frost killed 2 cover crop stands she had been counting on. She kept the notebooks the way her grandfather had and added her own observations beside his, cross-referencing years and conditions and decisions in the margins. When her cousin's son, a young man named Eli, came to work the farm in his early 20s, she did not lecture him. She handed him the notebooks and walked him to the fields and asked him what he saw. She had him dig soil samples from the east section, from the west section, from the border of the property where the old chemical applications had run heaviest, and from the creek bottom that had started it all. She had him compare them in his palm. She watched him feel the difference. The east section has been in the system the longest, she told him. 12 years. The west section 8. You can feel it. He could. He asked her how long before the whole farm looked like the east section. Depends on how well you listen, she said. If you were to walk those fields today, you would find soil that looks nothing like what Cora inherited. It is dark and structured, and it holds water the way a field has no business holding water in central Kansas. You would find earthworms at depths that still surprise people who study these things. You would find a farm that has not purchased synthetic fertilizer or pesticide in over 30 years, that produces reliable yields on dramatically lower operating costs, that has survived 3 droughts and 2 market crashes with less damage than its neighbors each time. On the desk in her grandfather's study, her study now, there is a stack of ledgers, Harold's notebooks faded at the edges, the handwriting growing more cramped and tired in the later years. Beside them is a second stack, taller, her own, and beside that, a third stack, shorter, that Eli has started keeping in his own handwriting, which is less cramped and more uncertain in the way of a young man who is still finding his way. On the last page Harold ever wrote on, in the summer before he died, he circled the question he had written years before and underlined twice and never answered. Cora found it when she first read the notebooks. She read it every year since. Something is alive in that creek bottom that the rest of the fields have lost. Underneath it, in her own handwriting, added years after he wrote it, she wrote her answer. Found it. Brought it back. It's here now. The story of Cora Mead is a simple one, in the end. The experts who came to her farm looked at the soil and saw a chemistry problem. They offered her chemistry solutions, faster, more certain, purchasable. She looked at the same soil and saw a biology problem, which required a biology solution, which required something that no company can sell and no extension agent can prescribe: time and patience, and the willingness to believe in a process before you can see the results. They thought she was confused, grieving, out of her depth. She was all 3 of those things. She just happened to also be right. And 30 years later, the soil remembered, because that is what living things do. Given the right conditions, given enough time, given someone willing to wait, they remember how to be alive. That is not a philosophy. That is not sentimentality. That is what the data in her notebook shows, season after season, in a handwriting that has grown steadier and more certain with every passing year. The fields don't lie. They never did. They were just waiting for someone patient enough to listen.